Marvin Devine. I'm saying bye to all the lies and all the times you cried, saying that I wasn't right, yet I was right by your side. You manipulator, playing games, your friends commentators, and I don't know what you say about our private conversations, but it's got them hating. Thanks to all the rumors you be claiming. It's cool, I'm done with you, so they can throw you a celebration. You gon' hate it when you see me with somebody living better. I'm trying to tell you that me just doing me gon' have you jealous.
Hello, folks. Welcome back to the program. This is Chris live in central Pennsylvania. My guest today is none other than the Chief Executive Officer of the Free Market Foundation from South Africa, Mr. David Ansara. Has been a guest on the program before and has been a wonderful host when I visited his organization in South Africa. And also had a lovely coffee with me once upon a time with Mark Oppenheimer and Joel Stransky, as I recall. That was pretty epic. How you doing today, David?
Oh, I'm great. Thanks, Chris. You must be proudly watching the Springboks performance. I see you wearing your colors there.
Yeah, it's one of those old school shirts they manufacture. I love this with the old Springbok logo on it. It's pretty cool. Yeah, no, it's nice. This is good for tropical Africa because it's kind of thin. It's almost like what's that material that people like to wear? Anyway, but it's very, very light. Good for Latin America. But here in central Pennsylvania, summertime, it helps out because humidity is pretty bad. So you were with the Free Market Foundation. We've talked many times about things. And today we want to talk about trade, of course, and these tariffs with Trump. So I think people who know me know that I believe in free trade. I don't like artificial barriers and quotas and things like that. And I'm not a fan of tariffs unless they're punitive. But here we find ourselves today, David, with just days away. Today's the 21st, and on the 1st of August, 30% tariffs, possibly 40% after what Trump said during the BRICS summit, another 10% for those who support BRICS policies. Being a BRICS member, one would assume that South Africa supports those policies. So there's a very real possibility that across the board, there's going to be a 40% tariff, or at least 30% on August 1st. Pretty frightening if you have a job in South Africa.
Yeah, very frightening indeed. And we at the Free Market Foundation are free marketeers. So look, if you go back throughout history from the time that Adam Smith was writing, David Ricardo, another famous Scottish economist, the benefits of trade are enormous. The move away in the 18th century from mercantilism, from protectionism, really unleashed a wave of prosperity across the world. And the benefits of being an open economy, being an active embracer of free trade, that I think produces positive sum gains. When you have a trade relationship with somebody, it's not that one of you loses and the other benefits necessarily. There is a double coincidence of wants. I often refer to the double thank yous when you go to the supermarket and you pay for your sandwich. You say thank you for the sandwich and the cashier says thank you for your custom. So free trade benefits everyone, and trade wars, I think, are unfortunate, unhealthy, and often result in increased costs and actually do the reverse of what you're trying to do in terms of protecting your market. So we're quite concerned about the prospect of tariffs in South Africa, or being applied to South Africa by the United States. But we also have to ask some very critical questions about South Africa's response to this. And I think my reading of the tariffs is that Donald Trump, I mean, he's the type of politician who tells you he's going to do something and then he actually does it, and then everybody gets surprised when he does the thing that he told you he was going to do. So we shouldn't actually be shocked by this. I think obviously he's been talking the language of tariffs for a very long time, even before his first administration. But now in his second presidency, he's been a lot more aggressive. And it's not just countries like South Africa or other BRICS countries, it's also some of his longtime, the United States' longtime trade partners like Japan, South Korea, Singapore, which I believe actually has a trade deficit with the United States, but still got hit with some of these punitive tariffs. But so, my view on this is the tilt towards protectionism by the Trump administration is unfortunate. But the question we should be asking is, how should South Africa respond to this? And the world is a complex place. Things don't always go the way that you want. And Donald Trump, I think, has his reasons for these tariffs. I think he's trying to appease a voter base that has been really negatively affected by deindustrialization in the United States. And I think that is a problem that we should not just glibly dismiss. I think it's not a problem exclusive to the United States. Many formerly industrialized countries have moved away from manufacturing as a core generator of value and have gone more into tertiary services, financial services, and we can talk about why that is the case. But I think ultimately we have to respond to the forces that are playing against South Africa. And I don't think South Africa has been doing itself any favors in its response. And I think what, the trade relationship is very important, and there are a lot of vested interests in that relationship. And we want to see a flourishing commercial and economic relationship with the United States. I think that should be the end goal. South Africa, America is South Africa's second largest trade partner. We need this to be a working relationship. And I think the kind of tilting at windmills and saying, Trump doesn't understand us, or he's bullying us, or he's interfering with our sovereignty, that's not really going to help to alleviate the situation. We need to be saying to South Africans, okay, well, if we take free trade seriously, like we say we do, and everyone's pointing fingers at the Trump administration saying, you guys are flying in the face of free trade. Well, we should be looking at the log in our own eye and saying, well, South Africa is not exactly a paragon of free trade itself. We have exorbitant trade barriers. We have non-tariff barriers. We impose tariffs on American goods, on Brazilian chicken, on motor vehicles, for example. And that does precisely what many people are criticizing Donald Trump of doing. So yeah, there's some initial thoughts there, but we can dive deeper, Chris.
Absolutely, and I'd have to say that I agree with you. The thing is that South Africa imposes tariffs on quotas on the number of U.S. car imports, but not on Chinese imports to South Africa. That's one example. The turf war that the South African government started several years ago under Obama, which they imposed 75% tariffs on our poultry imports, when we were simply getting rid of parts of chicken that Americans tend not to eat. And rather than grind it up in food meal, it was shipped to a market that was ready-made South Africa, and your producers couldn't keep up because we have industrial scale. So I understand the protectionism. I don't agree with it, but I understand it. But it's many things. It's not just that, though, David. I mean, it's and you just had an opening statement there, which I know that you know the answer to this. Didn't get a chance to go on it, but Trump does have a point, not just about deindustrialization and bringing manufacturing back to America, but he also has a point about a lack of reciprocity, which is something you alluded to with South Africa. But look at Europe. We charge 2.5% tariffs for automobiles imported from Europe, and they charge us 10%. And then every European country has a value-added tax, something America doesn't have. So in essence, every car shipped to Europe typically costs 25 to 40% more than the same car costs in America, simply because of the artificial charges imposed on it, which restricts the market. And people that want a Corvette or a Jeep or something like that, or a Tesla, can't get it because they can't afford it because of the Europeans. But you say this gentleman, David Ricardo and Adam Smith, this is a...
Well, I think you muted yourself there.
There we go. Yeah, I did mute myself. Yeah, my hand caught the top of the microphone. Yeah, but Wealth of Nations.
Invisible hand.
Yeah, the invisible hand of capitalism, free markets. That's what it was. No, but right here on my shelf, the Adam Smith, Wealth of Nations, that famous treatise that he put out a few centuries ago. And I agree with you 100%. I believe in free markets, but I'm not a fan of these tariffs, and I would hope that they could have been negotiated down. But what gets me, let's go to the crux of what you were saying a moment ago. What gets me is the reaction from South Africa's government. First off, they start this nonsense that Trump is being influenced by Elon Musk. I refuted that from the very beginning. Musk is not the reason the U.S. has a bad relationship with South Africa. The ANC is the reason the U.S. has a bad relationship. And I've run through a list of dozens of offenses, grievances that the African National Congress has executed against the United States and its national interests over the past 25 years, going back to 2003 with the Article 98 waiver they refused to sign for the Rome Statute for the International Criminal Court. They refused to do it, which ruined our relations with South Africa, and it's gotten worse since then. In 2024, bipartisan members of the House representatives from both parties introduced legislation to review the relationship with South Africa with an eye towards sanctioning senior government officials and ANC leaders. Now, this didn't go anywhere because Biden would never have signed it, and the Democrats controlled the Senate. But the Republicans control the House and Senate now. The bill has been reintroduced by a Republican with no Democratic backers, but they don't need them. It's not going anywhere. But my point here is that it's not Trump. This is a fractured relationship that has been fractured for a long time. And the government of South Africa has no ambassador in the U.S. It has no special envoy. That's a lie. He's never come here. He's not accredited. It has no trade representative in Washington. It has no trade delegation in Washington. It has squandered the 90-day period that Trump gave them, plus an additional 30 days, 120 days to work out an agreement. They've made no genuine effort to do that. And their focus is in China. And people keep saying, well, it's easy, just shift markets. It doesn't work that way, especially for things like finished goods, like automobiles. You have to have dealerships, establish relationships. You have to have functioning ports that can ship things around the world. And quite frankly, South Africa lacks all those things. So there will be near-term agony for South Africa's economy. Maybe a few years down the road, if anyone survives, they'll be able to shift to other markets. But you can't guarantee that the demand will pick up. I mean, I know they're talking about Tehran, but there's only so much mutton you can export to the Iranians before you run into trouble. Any thoughts on that one, David?
Yeah. So, look, I think the big concern really should be the diplomatic relationship with the United States. I think that's really what's driving a lot of this. And yeah, you might look at other countries that have good relations with the United States, diplomatic relations, but they're still being hit by some of these tariffs. That's fine, but we're not doing ourselves any favors by not making any meaningful attempt to really restore relations. I mean, it was quite interesting to me. I mean, I know, Chris, you follow South African affairs very closely, but the media response in South Africa to Ramaphosa's visit in May to the White House, it was like a different world.
It's a trap. It's a trap. He was set up. Oh, please.
Yeah, I don't know what live stream they were watching, but to me, South Africa didn't come out looking very positive there. Looked like a kind of the low growth, crime ridden rogue state that the Trump administration believes we are. And that was also an opportunity to say, hey, listen, Mr. Trump, we have had our differences. We see things a bit differently to you, but let's get a deal done. We know that you like to strike a deal, and even in this recent letter signaling the imposition of the tariffs, Mr. Trump still left the door open, and ultimately he's doing that for self-interest. He wants to he wants to show that he's the man in charge and that he can kind of reset relations with the world. But we have a strong interest there, and what is our national interest here? Is it to deny that farm murders exist? Is it to undermine private property rights through the Expropriation Act? Is it to impose 140 race laws on our economy and stifle growth and employment and opportunity, and to infuse our legislative framework with racialized laws? Or is it to be an open, prosperous, dynamic economy that's competitive and that has good relations with the rest of the world? I would hope the latter would serve our interests better. But at the moment, we're on a very worrying path, and the world is taking notice, not just the United States, and there's going to be negative consequences for us.
100%. I agree with you on that one. It's interesting because in the chat, people are talking right now about the 4 preconditions, which Corne Mulder brought back from the U.S., and he said were communicated to the South African government, which they deny, but their credibility is pretty weak at this point. An article came out this morning in City Press about Emma Powell, the member of parliament for the Democratic Alliance who went to the States a few months ago, and she released this story last week saying that Nkabisi Jonas had been denied diplomatic credentials, rejected, and denied a diplomatic visa back in May, and the government of South Africa knew about that. Corne Mulder said they were given these preconditions. Now, he and I don't know for certain, or maybe he does and didn't share, but both of us believe this happened behind closed doors at that meeting at the White House in May. And none of this was shared with the public. None of this has been talked about. They've made no effort. And so these 4 conditions, I'm going to put them on the screen for the audience. You won't be able to see them, but these 4 preconditions, according to Mulder mentioned, are things that I've talked about for months. But this is not about trade. This is about resetting the diplomatic relationship with the U.S., which is what you were alluding to, David, because that's what needs to be done first. This has nothing to do with the African Growth and Opportunity Act, nothing to do with these reciprocal tariffs that Trump is imposing. These 4 preconditions are amongst many things that must be done. But apparently Washington said, we're not even going to talk to you until you address these 4 issues. And they are: land expropriation will have to be done in accord with the Constitution, Section 25, market-based compensation. Farm murders have to be classified as a priority crime instead of being neglected. American countries must be exempt from the racial legislation of BEE because it's immoral and it's illegal. We don't allow that here in America. And the kill the boer chant must be publicly condemned. These are preconditions to reset the diplomatic relationship, which Ramaphosa fraudulently claimed was the answer. He said coming out of that meeting with Trump when he was disheveled after the behind closed door session, he had a press conference and he looked very disheveled and very shaken. He said, oh no, we've reset the relationship, which is poppycock. There's no way that's the case. That hasn't happened. And it's a bit disturbing to see the South African government whistling past the cemetery at this stage when so many lives in South Africa are going to be irreparably harmed. And some already have, David. I mean, I've been talking about this, but almost nobody's reporting on this. I think Business Tech covered this story as well. And that is exports to the U.S. with a 25% automotive tariff, which is a global one that Trump has applied for everyone, whether you're in Germany or in Canada or Mexico. It's 25% tariff on cars imported to the United States now from abroad. South African exports in the most recent reporting period dropped from 9,700 last year to 1,100 this year with a 25% tariff and the loss of AGOA preferential trade status. This can only get demonstrably worse. Any thoughts on any of that?
Yeah, so I think that the 2 major export industries are agriculture and automotive manufacturing. They're going to be hit the hardest by this. And we should be concerned in South Africa that these industries are going to be facing these headwinds. I mean, interestingly enough, South Africa's agriculture, I think, is a huge comparative advantage that we have. We have very good farmers, and I think their calls for heightened security and special treatment in terms of countering farm murders should be taken really seriously. And I mean, that's something that we should be doing anyway, regardless of these actions by the Trump administration, because if you eat a meal in South Africa, which everybody does every day, you owe that meal to a successful farm. And our export potential is huge. And, so automotive, I think, is a bit more of a complicated one. The automotive industry in South Africa benefits from extensive subsidization through the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition. So that is taxpayer-funded subsidization. And yes, that does create a lot of downstream opportunities for the suppliers into those original equipment manufacturers, the OEMs, like Mercedes, Volkswagen, BMW, etc. But at what cost? The import duties that South Africa applies to foreign manufactured vehicles in order to protect that native industry means that the cost of purchasing a vehicle in this country is exorbitantly high. And if we had a much more open market, more South Africans, I think, would be able to afford vehicles. And a vehicle is not just a means of transport, it's also an economic amplifier. So, I would be in favor of much more openness in terms of our industry. And, if you look at the foundations of South Africa's industrialization, really what it was built on is the mining industry. And we've successfully hollowed out the mining industry in this country through regulation, through shooting ourselves in the foot, through hostile policies like the MPRDA, and now the Expropriation Act and other new minerals legislation as well, which has been heavily contested as well. So, and we've undermined the private property rights, the mineral rights framework upon which the mining industry relies for certainty. So, if we are serious about industrializing South Africa and creating a sustainable manufacturing base, we also need to start having a tough conversation about all of the subsidies to entities like ArcelorMittal South Africa, which enjoys protection for the production of primary steel like hot rolled coil and so on, which is supposedly for the local market. but they don't pass that protection, those savings on to consumers. So what you get from ArcelorMittal is low quality, expensive steel, or not much cheaper than what you could get from, say, China. But if we had access to high quality steel from imports, then our local manufacturers would be a lot more competitive, and they would have cheaper inputs, and they might actually be able to start growing, and that would create more employment. At the moment, we're trying desperately to save the 4,000 or 5,000 jobs in Vanderbilt Park, and those jobs are important as well. But there's an opportunity cost that we're missing, potentially tens of thousands of more jobs. So I think that's how we should be thinking. Instead, we're sort of engaged in a bit of a tit for tat battle, and saying now, okay, well, the United States is going to go this protectionist route. We need even more protectionism, and we need to kind of retreat into our lager. And that's not really the mindset that we should be having. There's a world of opportunity that we could be taking advantage of. And so, these resetting this relationship is important, but I don't think what Mr. Ramaphosa did in May was the reset that South Africa needed. I think that was actually digging further deeper into the hole.
Yeah, that's exactly what it was. I think that Trump handed them a spade, and they happily dug their own grave, is what they did. It was pretty sad to watch that. In fact, as I said, as it was unfolding, and in my analysis afterwards and ever since then, is that people in the press in the U.S., in South Africa, said that this was a trap. It's utter nonsense. Ramaphosa requested the meeting. Trump cleared his schedule and generously offered him time around one of our most important holidays, Memorial Day, which is days away from that. We were preparing for parades and things like that, and Trump had some other foreign travel. He cleared his calendar to host him. He comes there. Trump played a video after. He didn't play the video until after Ramaphosa started trying to BS him and do his typical cupcake conversation. And then he said, okay, Natalie, can you dim the lights? She dimmed the lights. Natalie's now world famous, whoever Natalie is. But I think it was that black lady that was over by the screen. But anyway, so this happened. And then Trump showed videos. But what Trump didn't do was show any videos of Ramaphosa embarrassing himself with public statements at rallies like, I don't know what Donald Trump knows about South Africa, but he can keep his America, we'll keep our South Africa. Or members of the ANC that week telling America to get stuffed in Parliament. That stuff, basically, that's my words, but that's the gist of what they said. And also a number of insults that took place. What he did was showed videos that didn't necessarily embarrass Ramaphosa personally on a world stage. It just showed the situation in South Africa. He didn't show Ramaphosa or the ANC. He showed former members of the ANC, like EFF's Julius Malema and Jacob Zuma, who, by the way, was singing Kill the Boer as a sitting president in that video that was shown. And then he kind of muffed things up when he talked about the Normandy protests, saying that those are grave mounds, grave markers. He misspoke. But the media glommed onto that. And what I'm saying is that he gave Ramaphosa a chance at a discussion, despite what I think was Ramaphosa's disrespectful and rude behavior. For instance, and the media twisted all this stuff around, David. So Annika Larson asked the question of Trump, but it was a setup. It was obviously a setup. Mr. President, what will it take for President Ramaphosa to convince you there's no white genocide? And he'd already answered the question previously and said, well, about a white genocide. He said, I'm not convinced of that. That's what Trump said. He was asked a question about white genocide. He said, I'm not convinced of that. Then she asked this question, and Ramaphosa interrupted. Oh, no, I'll take this question. It will take President Trump listening to South Africans. Very condescending, very patronizing. He's a guest. He arrived 30 minutes late at the White House. Then he interrupts the president in the Oval Office. I mean, this was not just a bad look. This was insulting to Trump, and the media tried to turn this thing completely around. I think Trump was a very gracious host. I mean, obviously, I'm not entirely objective in this. I think I'm objective, but I mean, being an American, maybe it's not viewed that way. But I thought Trump was very generous. He could have come full guns blasting and embarrassed Ramaphosa right there on the screen, and Ramaphosa wouldn't be able to do anything because they don't control the cameras. They don't control the setting. Trump could have just destroyed South Africa, and he didn't do that, in my view.
Yeah, he didn't mention South Africa's diplomatic posture towards Israel as well, which is a key ally of the United States.
That wasn't mentioned either, and that was one of the arguments that South Africa's media and politicians have been arguing. This is all about Gaza. It's not about Gaza. That's navel gazing. That's just one issue.
Yeah, I mean, just as an aside, to me, it was really striking as well that I couldn't really remember a time ever where I've seen President Ramaphosa face media scrutiny like that. I mean, and he's been around for quite a while. I mean, he was president since 2018. And, I think Mr. Trump has introduced a whole lot of chaos and uncertainty into American politics. But there's a sort of a radical candor and transparency to how he does things, and I'm sure a lot of his publicists and people who work in his team sometimes struggle with all the curveballs that he throws on a daily basis. But there's something kind of refreshing about it. But yeah, I think my earlier point was South Africa has to choose its response. And whilst I feel very sympathetic to those who have now fallen victim to these tariffs, and they will be devastating. And I think maybe there's also not a full realization of how devastating these tariffs will be. I think you said on your show, Chris, that you think it could be anything between 1 and 2% percentage points of GDP knocked off. And yeah, I don't think that would be in the realm of impossibility. But so there's this kind of glib response from the media and other commentators. And there's a lot of talk about taco, that Trump always chickens out. But I think one of the mistakes that was made is somebody mentioned this to Donald Trump once, that there's this thing called taco. And so now he's determined not to lose face. So maybe he won't chicken out when it comes to these tariffs, which would be pretty negative. So I think the best response for South Africa is to say, listen, we want to reset here. Let's forge a bilateral trade deal. I think there's a lot of emphasis on AGOA, and AGOA has been very beneficial to South Africa. But ultimately, it's a piece of legislation that can be rescinded by the American Congress. I think far more durable would be to have a bilateral relationship where we're not crowbarred into AGOA. We were always sort of a bit of an outlier with AGOA anyway. I think I'm not sure about what the progress of AGOA is, but we're here in 2025, and this is a renewal year. So it'll be, I think, unlikely in the current environment that South Africa will continue to be an AGOA beneficiary. But the best thing that we can do is to accede to those demands, to say, okay, well, we take those 600 American corporates and firms that are operating in South Africa seriously. We want to make this a place where they can do business. We want their custom. We want these businesses to use South Africa as a springboard to the rest of the continent. Let's waive BEE restrictions. Bear in mind that a lot of these companies in the United States and in Europe actually cannot cede equity to local partners. They have often rules in their shareholder agreements which state that they're not allowed to do that. And many people will respond to that by saying, oh, well, no, there's equity equivalent schemes in BE, but that's still a tax on inward investment. I mean, ultimately what we're saying is that if you want to do business in this country, you have to pay a 30% entry tax. And we should be doing everything that we can to roll out the red carpet for foreign investment. Like, we should be hungry for capital and expertise and skills to come to this country and help us to develop, because we can't really do it on our own, I'm afraid. So withdrawing BE, I think, would be really important. Unequivocally guaranteeing and securing private property rights, that's an AGOA condition, by the way.
Yeah, which in my view, South Africa has not been eligible for AGOA since the introduction of that legislation in 2018. They should have been punished in 2018, but that's my view.
I mean, another condition of AGOA participation is supporting the United States' broader foreign policy and security interests, which I would argue is perhaps even more important for the Americans, because there are a lot of other AGOA beneficiaries that have not been too great on private property rights either. And so walking away from BE, and we have a precedent for this. I mean, in the 70s and 80s, I don't know if you're familiar with the Sullivan principles. I am. But American businesses said, well, we're not going to participate in racially discriminatory legislation in South Africa. Sorry, but we want to do business in South Africa. We realize that trade benefits South Africans, including Black South Africans, but we're not going to reinforce racially discriminatory practices. And a plan was made, and that enabled South Africa to continue to benefit from that relationship. But there were also terms attached to that. And once the principle had been conceded that business need not apply these discriminatory practices, then the whole thing kind of unraveled. So I think very importantly for us here at the Free Market Foundation is to say, well, actually, like, is BE really benefiting people? I mean, we released a report recently together with the Solidarity Research Institute. This was a co-authored study which assessed the economic costs of complying with BE. And we did very conservative measure, and our estimate is that it costs anything between 140 and 290 billion rand per year in terms of lost GDP, which equates to millions of jobs and trillions, of about 5 trillion rand since the imposition of BEE back in the early 2000s. So I think we're scoring massive own goals here, and we're pointing our fingers at the Donald Trump administration when we should actually be casting a more critical gaze at ourselves and saying, well, what can we do to improve our economic standing in the world?
Hey folks, you're listening to the Indaba Conversation with Chris here on the Indaba Africa channel. My guest today is David Ansara, the Chief Executive Officer of the Free Market Foundation, an organization with a long and storied history of fighting for what's right in South Africa. Oftentimes today, people look at them and they don't see them for who they are, kind of like the Institute for Race Relations. Both these organizations came up during an era when people were fighting for equality and free rights, and both organizations, Free Market Foundation and the Institute for Race Relations, not related, but both institutions out there fighting for what's right. And somehow today, because they're not on the side of those in power necessarily, people cast aspersions on what's unnecessary. But David's my guest. He's been here several times in the past. We're talking about these tariffs that Trump has put out. And David, you've talked about a few things I wanted to unpack. I want to get back to one of the things that South Africa does that is harmful to South Africans, and because it harms choice. And you talked about the industrial policy of South Africa, what's going on there. You know, the barriers they put in place for bringing vehicles in, for instance, is horrific. I mean, even with the 25% tariff, I priced basically a Toyota Tundra, which is similar to your one of your Buckies maybe shipped to South Africa, the Hilux. It's similar, not quite the same, but a similar vehicle. It's still 40% more expensive for me to buy the same vehicle in South Africa as what it costs to buy it in America. That's after a 25% tariff has been applied to vehicles imported here. So imagine, I know that when I used to live in Southern Africa, I still have my Toyota 4Runner, which is a V8 left-hand drive, and a lot of people were salivating at the prospect of me selling that in Southern Africa. In fact, I was offered $50,000 for a vehicle that cost me 48 a decade prior by an Indian fellow there in Botswana, but he was in India when I on a business trip when I left, so I still have it. But my point is that vehicle, you couldn't even get the equivalent of that in South Africa time. The best you could do was the Toyota that's similar to that. It only has a 6-cylinder in it, and that 6-cylinder truck in South Africa costs 60% more than what I paid for my truck at the same time in 2004 because of these barriers. It reduces costs for the consumer. I mean, it reduces choice for the consumer by having all these barriers, and it increases cost. And ultimately, as a free market trader, I think we're both in this boat, it's something that harms the economy more than it helps it, this protectionism.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I spoke earlier about a vehicle not just being a means of transport, but an economic amplifier. And, if you think of this phone that I have here, I mean, this was not made in South Africa, but this is enabling me to engage in other activities that create value. And I don't think it's important that South Africa makes mobile phones, but it's important that we find our niche and our comparative advantage. And mining and agriculture have been South Africa's comparative advantage for a long time. I mean, if you think of, we mentioned ArcelorMittal earlier, the primary steel manufacturer. There are conditions in South Africa which would lend themselves to steel production. There's, natural iron ore deposits. There's chrome and manganese and whatever else goes into steel production. But so I would say that on its face, there is a compelling market case for producing steel in this country. We have a bit of an energy problem, but that's also, I think, a self-created problem. We have some of the world's richest natural resource deposits compared to anywhere. I mean, I think probably the world's most of the world's platinum deposits are here, about 90%. I think the rest is in Zimbabwe and Russia, and so that's a huge advantage, and we should be making it as easy as possible to extract those minerals out of the ground. And we don't even need to necessarily beneficiate those minerals. But again, if you look back at the history of South Africa's industrial progress, I mean, a lot of the industry that we see around us today and that we take for granted, even services and things like media, I mean, for a long time, Anglo-American controlled almost half of the economy in South Africa, like the newspapers, a lot of the insurers, a lot of the the real estate sector was also in some way linked, to the mines. So I think we often engage in fantasies like, we should indigenize some of our production capabilities, and we can do this through state subsidies, which invariably gets subject to some kind of corrupt interest that kind of takes advantage of that, and politically connected cadres get access to those funds more often than not. And when you talk about state subsidization, you're really talking about taxpayer subsidization. You're taking value from one group of people and giving it to another. You're not creating new value. And that's another one of the assumptions and the premises of BEE as well. And it's this very static view of wealth, that you have this finite pie that just needs to be divided up more equitably, and then you will achieve development. No, you need to grow your way to development, and you can only do that by attracting foreign capital, by making it worth your while investing time, money, and energy in this economy, and getting profit from that. And so profit is a byproduct of economic production. It's not something that we should be ashamed of. It should be something that we should be seeking and embracing.
100%, and it's absolute nonsense. That's the problem with leftist, political leftists, socialists, and communists and others. They seem to think there's only 4 or 6 slices of pizza, and that's it. The pie is only a certain size. But as I've proven time again, the advent of the internet economy has proven that ideas can spark innovation and create millions of jobs out of thin air, out of someone's mind. I have an idea. You got these idiots running around America now producing an app to identify where immigration agents are running around arresting illegals in America. And so that's created a market just for that. The guy made an app. And yes, people have to have phones and there's electricity behind it all. But basically, this is a pre-existing marketplace that didn't exist that this guy's turned into something. So a rising tide does lift all boats, and that's something that leftists never seem to get. But let's go back to the industrial policy of South Africa. We could argue, and the ANC will have people argue, that it's necessary for the historically disadvantaged, resetting the stage, balancing things out. But even if that's true, and even if there's noble intent behind it, one cannot argue that policy has been even remotely successful. South Africa is deindustrialized. If we go back 30 years ago, 90% of the shoes sold in South Africa were manufactured in South Africa. And over 80% of the textiles sold in South Africa were manufactured in South Africa. We roll forward to today, less than 10% of the shoes sold in South Africa are produced there. And actually a little bit of a comeback recently. And only about 30% of the textiles are actually produced in South Africa. You talk about ArcelorMittal, what's happening there. South Africa is deindustrialized, and these parastatals have choked the marketplace off, ruining competition. Look at all the money that's been poured into South African Airways and the detriment it's done to the aviation market. It's a choice for consumers and for the flight routes and things. It's horrific. And electricity is another example of this. Instead of creating different parastatals that are wholly dependent on the other parastatal for distribution, generation, all that stuff, transmission, instead of breaking it into regional possibilities of potentially profitable private organizations and privatizing it, they've doubled down. This industrial policy has failed time and again. It doesn't work in every way they've tried it. And we see now the number of Black South Africans living in abject poverty is triple its highest point ever under the National Party in the apartheid era. I mean, this is abysmal, David. I mean, and people just don't see this. I don't understand why they don't see it unless it's intentional. And I'm not talking about the politicians. I know why they don't see it. I know a lot of them do see it. But the gravy train's there. The BE tenders are there, and people profit from them, and all the crooked things taking place in the taxi mobs and the construction mafia and all that stuff. That's all there. I get that. But the average people in the street just don't see it by and large.
Yeah, look, I mean, the National Party were not exactly free traders themselves.
No. Yeah, but to be fair to them, they had no option in some cases. They had to create things like Denel and Arms Corps, and they had to create SASL because they had to overcome sanctions, they had international prize status. But you're right. But I often say that the National Party and the ANC they're kissing cousins. I mean, the National Party loved patronage, but the favorite class were Afrikaners. The difference is the Afrikaners were competent, unlike the ANC's patronage class, which are largely incompetent. But yeah, they both like control. They both argue for the security state. They both try to quiet or quell dissent. They both believe in state-owned enterprises. So yes, very much akin. I agree with you. I want to throw that out there. I don't want people to think that I think that the National Party was something good. No, they're kissing cousins in my view.
Well, the best example of this is exchange control. I mean, exchange control was brought in precisely because of a lot of those sanctions during the apartheid era, and the Nats didn't want people taking their capital out of the country. But here we sit still with exchange control, and there are allowances, and the South African Reserve Bank, you have to apply for permission to take your own money out of the country. And all that does is it signals to foreign investors like, hey, if you invest here and you want to realize your profits and your legitimately earned profits, then there might be an impediment to you taking your hard-earned money back with you out of the country. And again, we need to move away from this zero-sum mentality. It's not like those foreigners are coming and taking what was once our money out of the country. They're generating new economic activity, new value, so making the economy bigger and creating opportunities that wouldn't have been there otherwise. So I think there's a lot of talk about how we need to move away from the past, but actually in South Africa we replicate a lot of the failed policies of the past, and I think that's very sad, and it's South Africans who suffer because of that. So I just before I forget, there was a really I think important point that came out of our earlier discussion, which is, Corné Mulder and Emma Powell have gotten a lot of heat in South Africa for supposedly breaking with protocol and engaging in diplomacy that is not aligned with Durko's view of diplomacy. And I think that we as South Africans should be celebrating those two people and others who are acting in the legitimate interests, not only of South Africa as a whole, but also their constituents. I think we need to also, I think, in South Africa have more of a sense of representative politics, that you don't always need to toe the national line. And sometimes the patriotic thing to do is to actually criticize the government. And one of the downfalls, I think, of the GNU is it tries to homogenize governance, and it does so by replicating ANC core foundational beliefs, like BEE is one of them. And sort of there's an expectation like, okay, now you're part of the national government, you have to toe the line. No, you don't. You have a duty to represent those people who voted for you. And I think the Powell example and the Mulder example are good ones. But, there are a lot of citrus and wine exporters who are going to be hit very hard in the Western Cape. The Western Cape government should be engaging in its own diplomatic efforts. If it is doing so, then maybe I haven't seen it, but and if it is doing so, it should be encouraged to do so.
Well, sorry. I was going to say that if they're doing it, it's very quiet. I'm not aware of any effort by the Western Cape government. I've only heard Alan Winde say nothing.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that the Western Cape government should establish a trade mission in Washington, D.C. and say, hey, like, we don't agree with the ANC's view on foreign policy. We're willing to engage with you. We want to do business with you. And that might not be an officially sanctioned diplomatic mission, but it represents a legitimate interest. And I think farmers and other exporters in the Western Cape should be encouraging their provincial government to do that. I mean, the business group Sakeliga, as a civil society organization, has been engaging its own diplomatic efforts for a long time. I mean, joining Dr. Mulder was Gerard Papenfuss of NIASA, who was the other of the three amigos. It was Theo de Jager from SAI. And, he had a legitimate cause to be there. He was representing the interests of family-owned businesses. And I would say, where have the other agricultural lobby's been in terms of getting us in front of policymakers in Washington. They should be doing the same.
Well, I mean,
So we should be
it's
celebrating those people.
this is perfectly fine. I mean, K Street is full of lobbyists. There's nothing wrong with a Western Cape citrus lobbying group that comes to the United States to lobby on behalf of policies for them. Whether it is a GOA or a bilateral agreement, you would think they would have an interest to be in there. David, I've got to interrupt for a second and deal with something here very quickly. So in the chat, folks, listen, the gentleman listed as Sloat is an evil, demented racist. So just ignore him. His comment at 9:40 said, David, great shock. Regret to see you joining right-wing Wyatt on his video. He says the ANC will always remain African and black. He capitalizes black. Black is an adjective. It's not a noun there. So that's grammatically incorrect, Sloat. Because Ramaphosa was late for a TV broadcast. Plain racist talk. Now, it's ironic, David, that this gentleman comes on and says that when I did a video that was released earlier today in which I criticized the ANC for attacking Emma Powell, calling her racist for talking about South African policy, when I said that the government of South Africa is not black. It represents all groups and is comprised of all ethnicities. Ladies and gentlemen, just ignore the gentleman. You can block his comments. He's an evil, demented crap weasel who has personally targeted me, and his racist comments against me to try to destroy my broadcast and my program have been met with very poor results. So just ignore Sloat. Sorry about that, David, but he's attacking people, and people are falling for the baiting in the chat. Just stay away from him. You can block the individual by right-clicking on the radials, and you can block his comments. But I'm going to leave him in there to let him expose himself as a racist each and every day, which he does. I haven't seen him in the chat in a long time. Sorry about that, David. I just had to address that very quickly because it's been going on for about 7 or 8 minutes, and it's just becoming very distracting for people in the chat. I want them to listen to what you have to share and not what Sloat has to share, because he's a very sad, pathetic individual who splits his time between Amsterdam and the Garden Route, and maybe he should just go live in Mongolia. Anyway, sorry about that. I just wanted to cover that very quickly. But yeah, I think that what you talked about earlier, Emma Powell and Corney Mulder and others coming to the States, at least they can get an office call. There's nobody from the government of national unity who can get an office call. There's no ambassador, no special envoy, no trade representative, no trade delegation, and the government's just squandering this time. I mean, you would think. I saw a comment from the presidency saying that Dr. Mulder didn't get an appointment with Ramaphosa because they don't discuss things that are done in unofficial capacity in diplomacy. I'm sorry. Are they familiar with diplomacy? I spent decades working in embassies. Much of diplomacy around the world is conducted informally by third parties, by civil agencies who bring governments together, and by independent actors. I mean, this is just nonsense. And to make that situation worse, David, Dr. Mulder is not exactly an alien. His party is part of the Government of National Unity Coalition. You would think his coalition partner, Cyril Ramaphosa, would want to hear what he found out when he went back to the state, if for no other reason to find out if it differed what Ramaphosa claimed he heard from Trump when he was there. So yeah, going back a few years there. So I mean, they are whistling past the cemetery. That's the only explanation here.
Yeah, I mean, a theory that I've had for a while is that South Africa is actually deliberately, or the South African government, specifically the ANC portion of it, is deliberately trying to sabotage the relationship with the United States. And I mean, I think it's a lot of factors point in that direction. I mean, the fact that VC Jonas didn't have his credentials received and kind of like nothing was said about this. I mean, I find it unbelievable that, I mean, we always, I think, suspect that the government is often very casual with the truth. But I mean, this is a deliberate obfuscation and a lie on behalf of the government. And there needs to be some accountability for that. And, you know, we can debate about the merits or demerits of the industrial policy of South Africa, but I mean, who's going to suffer the consequences of that? It's going to be the exporters. And yeah, you know, if you look at Ibrahim Rasool's comments and his ejection and classification as a persona non grata, there's now, you know, this refusal to accede to any of the demands of the United States. Sort of wonder, like, maybe there's a sense of active sabotage here, that Ramaphosa sees this brave new world led by the BRICS, a new world order, and that he wants to undermine the so-called Washington consensus, which can debate whether or not that still exists anymore. But, you know, there's a deliberate posture here. What do you think, Chris?
I think there is a deliberate effort here. It's intentional, this neglect, and I think that they thought they were going to get support from elsewhere. One of the places, it seems clear to me, they thought they're getting support, at least for the party, to help the ANC survive politically, for the bills that they owed, for their election campaign, and just to pay their salaries, was obviously coming from Tehran. But no one's proven that, but that seems pretty obvious based on anecdotal evidence, because where does the 102 million rand come from out of nowhere when the sheriff of the high court shows up at Latuli House to inventory all the items for confiscation to be sold at public auction? But I think they honestly think they're going to get help from places. But the Chinese have put barriers and tariffs in place to prevent South African agricultural goods from coming in at a level they should be able to ship to China, because China can't feed itself. It relies on food imports. And as you said, South Africa not only has a competitive advantage, they have a comparative advantage, which is what you really want when you're producing things, is a comparative advantage. Your cost opportunity is lower than your competitors, and then people get your products, you get a better product, and you make more money on it. So I think it is intentional, and I think it's just stupid beyond belief what they're doing here. And who suffers? It's not the so-called white monopoly capital or white industrialists who's suffering. Those people, if they exist, are still living in their beautiful plush luxurious mansions in Sandton and in the Western Cape. It's the people in the Cape Flaps, the people in Alexandria. It's the people in Soshanguve, in Chatsworth. These are the people that are suffering because there's no jobs being created, because jobs are disappearing. And it's not just that. South Africa is collapsing all around us. I mean, I read this newspaper story yesterday about the lady who a decade ago hit a pothole that was so big she flipped her car over and she's paralyzed. She's scarred and injured for life. I mean, this is insane what's happening in South Africa. And what was once a slow degradation of South Africa's economy and its workplace and its environment has turned into a free fall. And it's because of these policies. And they're not going to get the support they think. First off, let me go just a little bit longer on this one, David. And I'll get both of us back on the screen here so people can see a reaction here. But here's the thing. BRICS is a joke. There's nothing to it. You go back before the BRICS expansion in 2023, and 85% of the GDP of the BRICS nations was China. And that's a China whose economy's growth was facilitated by Bill Clinton, the United States, supporting and endorsing China's entry into the World Trade Organization, whose rules they violated from the day they joined it. And so then their copyright theft, their trademark theft, their intellectual property theft, their spying, their barriers, all these things have allowed them to become the workshop of the world to the detriment of virtually every economy around the world, including South Africa's. China is not lowering barriers for South African goods. We can see Paul Mashatile, Parks Tao, 6 ministers, including John Seenhuisen in China, ostensibly working on a trade deal or doing something. But nothing's going to come from that. And they're ignoring what needs to be done here. The BRICS is a joke. There is no treaty to establish BRICS. There's no mutual defense pact. There's no freedom of movement from South Africa to Beijing to work without a visa, like the Schengen Agreement. There's nothing like that. It's total fabrication. And those who believe in BRICS are dishonest or they're lunatics, because there's nothing there. When they actually have a treaty on some area that covers every country in there that benefits the countries, then I'll start believing there's something to BRICS. Right now, it's just a bum-hurt, global South, anti-Western cafe clutch. And that's BRICS.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. Like, what is BRICS for? And what is the kind of meat on the bones? I mean, it just seems like they meet every so. I mean, even the G20, I mean, I'm very critical of the G20 as a structure. I think these kind of multilateral talk shops
it's too big. It's too big. I mean,
yeah.
It's just like, so people are complaining about Security Council. Let's add to the UN Security Council. No, 5 permanent vetoes is enough. You don't need more people in there, because then nothing ever gets done. You cannot reach consensus with dozens of players. It just doesn't work. That's why the African Union doesn't work very well, because they can't take a decision unless every African Union member agrees with it. The European Union doesn't need that. That actually has sovereignty over its member states, and they can decide in the European Parliament to impose things. It may be unfair, but they can do it. You can't do that in the AU. The G20 is a joke. It should not exist. Once you got the G7, that was too much. When they invited Russia in as a participant, I'm like, this thing has gone sideways.
Yeah, but I mean, BRICS has so many internal contradictions. I mean, China and India are strong rivals. I think, and actually India is a really good example of a country that is played very shrewdly on the international stage. So, I think South Africa puts itself out as this kind of non-aligned country, this impartial mediator, punching above its weight, and brokering peace deals in the world. But actually, I mean, really, like, if you look at their anti-Israel position, I mean, I think it's quite obvious that they are aligned against Israel and in support of Iran. And the deputy minister of Durka was signing the condolence book after the military actions by Israel and Trump against Iran. And there are many examples of that alignment. But India, by contrast, is genuinely non-aligned and quite strategic in the way it aligns its interests. Like they have this rivalry with China, but they're still part of BRICS. They buy Russian oil, but they still have a lot of trade with Europe. They're seen as an ally of the United States, and they have kind of that military and strategic relationship. I mean, I think you would probably know more than me on that. But they're acting in India's interests. Like, you don't have to be some kind of supplicant nation that just goes along with whatever other countries say you must do. But you got to think like, well, what's the kind of broader objective here? And I think South Africa is missing a huge opportunity. Like, I think there's nothing wrong with going to China and negotiating an agricultural trade deal. I think that's important. And I don't think necessarily the United States would be opposed to us doing that. But what they are opposed to us doing is undermining America's interests. So and I think we can actually have it both ways. We can trade with various countries. We can play a meaningful role in the diplomatic community internationally. But at the moment, we're kind of revealing our hand, and what it shows is hostility towards the United States and other Western countries as well. And I think my wish is for European countries and the United Kingdom to start also asking some more critical questions of South Africa. I think this, in the wake of Trump's executive order in February, we saw a lot of European diplomats kind of coming out and saying like, no, South Africa is this rainbow nation, non-racial democracy, constitutional democracy, and nothing to see here. And I don't think that was helpful. I think maybe it was well intentioned, but we need more pressure actually from the international community. And when you were here last, and you hosted that meet and greet out in Glenfinesse, that was one of the things that I said to that audience that came to meet you, was that people like you, Chris, are like the tip of the spear. Like, we actually need people like yourself to be applying the pressure. And I think you do it not because you dislike South Africa, but because you love South Africa. You want to see South Africa succeed, and you recognize that there's a lot of great people here, a lot of huge potential, but on the current trajectory, we're going to be squandering that potential, and a lot of people are going to be leaving the country if things continue to go that way. And a lot of the people who came to hear you talk were asking you about the refugee program to the United States. And I think whilst it's good that somebody at least is reaching out to say, here's a helping hand, if you're experiencing violence or discrimination, come to our country and you'll have an opportunity to start your life afresh. Most Afrikaners and most South Africans want to flourish here. They want to see their country succeed. They want to see their family succeed. They've been here for generations, and they have a strong sense of attachment and fealty towards the country. They don't necessarily want to go and start their life anew somewhere else. But if things get bad enough, and things are getting pretty bad, they're going to start to entertain those thoughts. And so we need to say, okay, well, actually, if we want to succeed, how do we do that? Well, we got to get competitive. We got to treat people equally before the law. We got to unleash the absolutely incredible potential of this economy and its people.
Well, what a concept, David, treating people equally before the law. I mean, what a novel concept that is. I got to tell you, but seriously, well, thank you for your comments, Sarah. That is where it comes from. I don't like attacking South Africa or exposing its flaws, but someone must be honest. And the politicians in South Africa aren't being honest. You have to ask the question, what are people doing? Whose interest are they acting in? And it seems clear to me that the government of national unity is not acting in the interest of South Africans. It's acting in the interest of its constituent members of the government of national unity, by and large. The DA claims that they're fighting for jobs, but they're not, in my view. But that's a personal view. They can take exception to that, and they're welcome to take exception to that. But the DA, for instance, not to pick on the DA, but they made all these lines in the sand when they ran for office. And they actually, in my view, had the strongest negotiating position for a coalition. The ANC, which was accustomed to ruling on its own since 1994 without needing votes from any other party, always having a majority. The lowest they had was 57%, but usually north of 60%. And once they even had enough to override the Constitution, 68% of the electorate, 69%. But they're accustomed to that, and they've become comfortable in that. So they were forced in a position with just 40% of the popular vote, and they needed a coalition partner. MK, Jacob Zuma, that's anathema to the ANC. They will eat the ANC from the inside out if they went into coalition, so that's not going to happen. EFF is a dwindling party with dwindling support. We saw that already in the election when they dropped below 10%, and anyone that was honest would see that they're going to get worse, and we see that. KwaZulu-Natal is a good example of that. They've been almost completely obliterated in KwaZulu-Natal. There's almost no presence of EFF in that province because of the rise of MK, primarily, but not exclusively. So there was nothing in the cards except an alliance with the Democratic Alliance, a coalition. And the Democratic Alliance walked into this thing and formed an agreement, which then the ANC went immediately behind their backs and invited other parties to come into, which wasn't the agreement. And now they're running around talking about how they're going to kick the DA out of it. You can't kick the DA out of it. It's an agreement between the ANC and the DA. You can both abrogate the agreement. One of you can leave it, the other one can leave it, but one can't kick the other out. That's not the terms of it. It's comical, but it's because, and I said this at the negotiations last year. I said, what is going on here? The DA has all the cards, but they're not acting that way. They walked away with none of the security cluster, none of the intelligence, none of the important ministries that actually could change the trajectory of South Africa for the better. Foreign ministry, finance, defense, police, none of that's all retained. All the real, genuine, hard power in the country is under the control of the ANC, and they're acting with impunity as if Latuli House still runs the country. And it's funny to listen the other day to Ramaphosa talking about how he had to be late for the presentation to the country, his 10-minute speech the other night about Senzo Mkhunu. And he said, well, the president said, well, he had to consult with his coalition partners. Really? He didn't consult with them when he signed the Expropriation Without Compensation Act, which he'd actually signed in December, not in Davos when he made big fanfare of it. He also didn't consult them on the Basic Education Laws Amendment Act or on the black tax, the 3% slush fund. None of this stuff did he consult his coalition partners on, and caught them all off guard. And suddenly he's late 38 minutes to talk to the nation because he was consulting with his coalition partners after he'd already had a conversation with Mkhunu on Friday. This is Sunday. Look, I mean, these people, it's difficult to take them seriously, David. It really is difficult to take these people seriously because they just a bunch of amateurs. And it's disappointing because the ANC had the educated technocrats in its party at one time, the Trevor Manuels, the Thabo Mbeki, and people know I have a strong distaste for Thabo Mbeki. I'm not trying to promote him, but I'm saying at least he was competent in some respects. Those people. Sorry?
Yeah, to take him seriously. Like,
yeah.
You might disagree with him, but you took him seriously.
Exactly. I disagree with him, especially on his stance on HIV, but I disagree with him, but at least I could take him seriously. I can't take any of these people seriously. Ronnie Lamola, seriously? Minister 30%, I now call Minister 5%, Angie Mocheka, this is, and then, of course, Naledi Pandor, I mean, she's actually pretty smart, which is pretty evil. But I mean, how do you take these people seriously in South Africa? It's difficult.
Yeah, you made some comments there about the DA, and we as the Free Market Foundation were quite skeptical of the formation of the GNU, and we understood at the time, yes, why people want to go that route to avoid the so-called Doomsday Coalition scenario. But unfortunately, the DA has kind of painted itself into a bit of a corner because they keep reiterating, like, listen, we joined the government to avoid this catastrophic situation of MK or EFF coalition with the ANC. But then whenever they get bullied in the GNU, as they invariably do every few weeks, then they threaten to leave, and then they walk back from that threat because the ANC keeps calling its bluff, and they know that if they dissolve the GNU now, their voters are going to say, well, but you said that this was going to be Armageddon if you left the GNU, and now you're willfully creating that situation. So that's why we were actually kind of trying to encourage a no-elition alternative of a confidence and supply agreement where you have an ANC minority government and the ANC controls the executive, but very importantly, they don't have full control over the legislature. And where did we see the DA at its best since May 2024 was during the VAT conflict. And that actually didn't take place within the closed doors, behind the closed doors of the cabinet. It took place in full view of the South African public in the legislature, and there is where they had real power. So you mentioned the hard power. So you got to go and find that power and leverage. You use that leverage to get what you want, because if you don't do that, if you kind of play Mr. Nice Guy, the ANC is going to keep messing you around, and your constituents will be quite upset with you when their interests start to get sacrificed at the altar of supposed national unity.
Well, it seems like every single element of the National Democratic Revolution is coming to fruition under the government of national unity. I mean, expropriation without compensation, massive centralized control of local education, a transformation fund to steal profits from profitable corporations to fund enterprises based on skin pigmentation. I mean, I could go on and on here, but all the things in the National Democratic Revolution and those in the so-called radical economic transformation faction of the ANC, their dreams are coming true, all under the aegis of the government of national unity. I mean, how do the coalition partners not see this unless they just like the gravy train?
Yeah, and the danger there is that actually the DA and also the other political parties' participation in the GNU actually lends legitimacy to these socialist policies that are actually going to immiserate South Africa. And yeah, maybe you can say, well, it's not my portfolio that's implementing the transformation fund or something like that. But the voters kind of see the consequences of all of these hostile actions. And the worst is when you have, say, something like the Expropriation Act or the Bella Act having to be implemented by a DA minister. I mean, that is just a horrendous situation. And the DA education minister will say, well, we're going to fight this in the regulations, and we're not going to implement certain aspects of it. But I mean, that kind of nuance doesn't get transmitted to the electorate. They just see, oh well, now the government's interfering in my school governing body and telling me what language I must implement in my school. So it just doesn't wash. So I think there was an alternative timeline of the DA and others being involved in a confidence and supply kind of situation where they say, well, we'll vote for you, Mr. Cyril Ramaphosa, as president, but you're going to have to, come and support certain conditions that we're going to put in place. We'll pass your budget, but only if you trim the budget and start to reduce state spending. There you've actually got real leverage. And I suspect that when the GNU inevitably unwinds and collapses, people are now suddenly going to be talking about what are the alternatives. And I just want to remind everyone listening and watching that the FMF from the beginning has been saying that confidence and supply would be the way to go. We may or may not be right about that. I'm sure it wouldn't deliver a nirvana necessarily, but it would enable particularly parties like the DA to stay true to what are the interests of its constituents and to fight. I think the DA is, we sometimes have criticized the DA for not being liberal enough, but you can't dispute that they've been a very effective opposition. And opposition is kind of the comfort zone of the DA, and that oppositional role has been muted and nullified somewhat by being within the GNU. So yeah, those are some of my thoughts there.
Well, you're not exactly alone in that boat. I'm also rowing in the same direction. And from the very beginning, people asked me about the possibilities. And I said that the very real possibility, because I, of course, and I will crow about this, famously predicted that the ANC would get 38 to 42%. And I didn't predict that 6 weeks before the election. I predicted the first week in November after the municipal elections in 2021, based on what I saw around the country. I said that there's no way. Now, the truth changed. Some events changed it so they could have done better. Some made it worse. But in the end, as MK was formed towards the end, I stuck with my analysis, and people said I was crazy, and I was right. And my argument was that a plurality government may be the best outcome because they can't pass legislation to sap your liberty. If they don't have the votes to put more legislation and make bigger government, that may be the best outcome. And that's the argument I made. And, it's puzzled me because aside from your organization and myself, almost no one else was talking about this. They're all talking about these coalitions. And I'm like, no, you don't have to have that. The ANC can rule as a plurality government with control of the executive. and then they just won't get anything accomplished in the legislature, the parliament. And that may be the best possible outcome for South Africa. That's what I argued. And then when the DA went into this, I'm thinking, well, let's see if they've got any teeth. No ministries of any substance. The ANC gave them ministries that were broken, that need to be fixed, that the ANC can credibly take credit for fixing. Home affairs. Yeah, people don't have to wait 5 years for a passport anymore in most cases. People don't have to wait forever for this, that, and the other. And then, agriculture, something that needed a lot of attention, but they took some key stuff away from that. And one of the key things they took away from that was the land result here. But anyway, David, I think we have to wrap up here shortly, don't we? Or your publication. Oh, I thought you were telling me, send me a message. You just sent me a link to something. Do you want me to bring that up and talk about that, or is that just for later?
Yeah. I just wanted to point your viewers in the direction of Liberty First, which is the Free Market Foundation's policy agenda for this administration, for this parliamentary term. And there's a publication there called Freedom to Trade Internationally, which delves into some of what we were talking about earlier around the kind of tariff regime and why South Africa should liberalize its approach to trade and industrial policy and financial controls and so on.
So is a lot of what I said in that publication?
Yes, definitely.
Because I haven't read that, so that's cool. Sometimes it's nice to read something where you're drinking the Kool-Aid already. So, so I've put it in the chat and pinned it to the top. So if anybody wants to go find that, so sorry, I thought you were sending me a quick note like your phone rang or something like that. But we are. Can you stay about another 15 or 20 minutes, or have you got a commitment you've got to run off to now?
Yeah, no, maybe another 5 minutes. I need to wrap up.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let's do this then. Let me give you a chance to. I want you to kind of just synthesize where we're at and what's happening, because the tariffs are coming. I mean, barring divine intervention, by power of prayer maybe might help here, but barring divine intervention, South Africans are going to be hit hard. And as I said, the automotive industry has already been hit hard by 25% tariff, and it's only going to get worse as it goes to 30, possibly 40%. And it doesn't seem like the government of South Africa wants to address this, and they're just going to whistle past the cemetery as South Africans lose their jobs and industries collapse. It's very unfortunate. But any thoughts on that? And if you got anything positive, Dad, that'd be nice. We can hear something positive about South Africa. But David Ansara, the floor is yours, sir.
Yeah, so you mentioned earlier that our manufacturing base has actually declined quite a lot. So if you look at a gross fixed capital formation, which is like the investment in hard assets like factories, mines, the installation of machinery, that's a signifier of real tangible long-term investment. So that's different to sort of like hot money flows that, portfolio flows that go in and out very quickly. Like from the bond market or equity markets and so on. That used to be about 25% as a proportion of GDP. It's now at around 11 or 12%. So, that shows you that there's just less investment in industrial capability in the country. But the good news is that we can actually easily turn that around. And we've seen countries like Argentina recently under President Milei. I mean, Argentina was very much analogous to what has been happening in South Africa over the last few decades. I mean, Peronism is statism, collectivism, and it's also corporatism. This idea that the state kind of acts as this kind of mediator role between labor and business and government, and that you kind of come up with this kind of consensus. That's very similar to Mr. Ramaphosa and the ANC's kind of vision that the state is the kind of convener of the whole of society. But actually, you need to break that paradigm. And I think what Milei has shown is that you can be a libertarian, and a lot of people used to criticize libertarians for being unrealistic and maybe being a bit naive about power. But Milei is an exception to that. He knows and understands power, and he also understands state power, even though he's an anarcho-capitalist. And what he has done is remarkable. I mean, they have closed down a lot of these inefficient state-run entities. In our Liberty First policy proposals, we have one on the size of government. We say that South Africa needs 10 government ministries. That's it. None of this like 36 ministers and 40 deputy ministers, and you don't need that. You can care about sport, you can care about the Springboks without there being a ministry of sport. And these entities, if people value them, they will be well funded and well organized, and actually state involvement often distorts the incentives in something like that. So Millet understands that you need conflict. You need to directly confront these embedded interests. You're not going to consensus seek your way out of these problems. That's why the national dialogue is such a misdirection. And you have a lot of well-meaning people like sports stars and beauty queens joining this. But what it does is it reinforces the status quo, which is heavy state involvement in the economy, BEE writ large, undermining private property rights, hostility to investment, all that stuff we've been talking about. So what we need is we need to scrap that. And South Africans are nice people, but sometimes they can be a bit too nice. They all want to get along, and everybody wants to kind of pat each other on the back about how great it is that we're engaging in dialogue, and this is kind of our gift to the world, that we like to talk. And people point to the negotiations in the 90s, but the discussions in the 90s were a negotiation of two competing power blocks, right? So in South Africa, there is an assault on private enterprise, on the private sector, on people's property rights, their basic fundamental rights. These are not like kind of technocratic policy decisions that may produce efficiency or inefficiency or whatever. Like, your right of ownership is fundamental to your existence as a human being, right? If you don't have the right of ownership, you cannot determine your own future. Your right to start a business without being forced by the state to hand over a third of the value of that business to some silent partner, some political appointee. These are basic things. And if we value our lives here in South Africa and our way of life, and the enterprises that we've built, and the homes that we've built, and the commercial relationships that we have with the outside world, we actually need to start fighting more with the state. We need to be saying, like, hey, you have no dominion here. You have no sovereignty over my business. This is my business, and you must stay out of my affairs. And so my colleague Martin van Staden recently tweeted that we need to reintroduce a word into South Africa's lexicon, which is resist. We need to resist some of these harmful policies. And I need to kind of say some critical things about the corporate sector in South Africa. The corporate sector often goes along to get along with these policies, very happily implements BEE and boasts about its BEE scorecard on the signatures of its emails and so on. Don't do that. You don't have to. You can engage in these things strategically. You don't want to incur risk for your employees or for your shareholders or your directors and incur liability, but you can find ways of resisting in your interactions with the state. And you need to state-proof yourself. That's a concept that we've been advocating for a lot here. So, unilaterally going to Washington, D.C. and meeting with trade representatives there, that's an act of resistance. Saying no to BEE is an act of resistance. Taking the Expropriation Act to court, as the Free Market Foundation will be doing, as AfriForum is doing, and others, Sakelige as well, that is a form of resistance. And, I think that is not oppositional. That is constructive, actually, because we recognize that there's a lot worth preserving in South Africa, but you need to fight for it. It's not going to preserve itself. You need to actually defend what you value. And that's a great underlying motivator of the work that we do at the Free Market Foundation. And if you believe in that mission, we'd really like your support as well. So if anybody's watching this who'd like to contribute to us financially, or if they can't support us financially, they can help us by spreading our message, reposting our content, sharing our videos, and all that stuff. That would be really appreciated.
Well, David Ansara, thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate this constructive conversation. Links to the Free Market Foundation is in the video description, as well as a link to David's Twitter account. I think we need to get him some more Twitter followers, so go subscribe to him over there, folks, if you don't mind. I'll also add the link for that publication, which you shared during this stream. I do appreciate that. Before you go, I just want to say something very quickly here, and you don't have to respond. You're welcome to if you want, because we're wrapping up. But you touched on something. You gave an example here of Argentina, and what I want to say is that one of the reasons I don't give up on South Africa is that the worse things get, the easier it is to make a change that is noticeable immediately. What I mean by that is that Mozambique was utterly destroyed by its conflict from 1974 and 75 all the way up until 1992, just obliterated. It was already a backward economy that wasn't very advanced industrially, but it was agriculture based. And that agriculture was destroyed by landmines and incessant fighting by Renamo and Frelimo. From 1992, for about 25 years, Mozambique had the world's fastest growing economy because it was growing from a base of almost zero. The ruling government in South Africa has done so much carnage, so much damage to the industrial base, to the infrastructure, to governance, to civil society, that it would take very little in the way of good governance to turn this ship around and South Africa be saved. That's my thoughts on it. That's why I don't give up on South Africa. It's an amazing place, but it's going to take good faith commitment by people in politics in South Africa to turn this thing around. And right now, that good faith just isn't there. So I think that your example of Argentina is a brilliant one to bring up. And just, I mean, that's almost overnight. And Argentina was the world's sixth largest economy in the 1930s. People forget that. Argentina was a success. And then the Perón came in office, and it's all been downhill since then, even starting wars with the United Kingdom, two dying empires. But anyway, so I think that that's a great example, and that there's hope for people. But it's going to take a commitment. The SBE's got to go away, and you start from there, and respect private property rights, and that'll really get things turned around.
Yeah, and it's about accepting that life is not about solutions; there's only trade-offs, as Thomas Sowell once said. And I think we really need to just appreciate what Milei has done in Argentina. The levels of inflation not just double-digit inflation, like triple-digit inflation that country has experienced in the past. Inflation is now down to month on month, like kind of under 2%, which is pretty incredible. But also the size of the state, they've trimmed, closed the public broadcaster, they've basically reset the entire revenue collection system, overhauled the immigration system, the privatization of state-owned assets, and investment is flooding in. Removal of rent controls that's just created, and overnight, a tripling of the availability of rental stock in Buenos Aires. There's this pent-up demand, and if you can unleash it, the potential is limitless. And unfortunately, this idea of opportunity cost, you don't see the costs that you're incurring often by taking these moves. Capital just quietly goes elsewhere when you have a hostile policy framework. And so I think if you reflect back on the beginning of our conversation, and thinking about tariffs and all of these kind of exogenous forces, and the ANC government, we're almost kind of prisoners of this antiquated socialist ideology that guides the ANC. It's easy to get despondent, but you don't want to give into despondency. There's huge potential that we can unleash if we are willing to fight back against these kinds of policies. And, so that requires an appreciation for freedom and individual action, but also an appreciation for the other side of the coin, which is taking responsibility. If you value the things here in our lives here in South Africa, you got to take responsibility for it. And that might mean getting involved in a security structure in your neighborhood, or joining a business forum or a business chamber that's advocating for liberalization of policy, or supporting an entity like the Institute of Race Relations or the Free Market Foundation, where I'm from, or Sakalika or AfriForum. These are the groups that are actually standing up and fighting for a better South Africa, and we should be supporting them. But you don't. You can support others to do that, but you can also do that in your own life as well, and that is contagious, and that's how these broad political movements can actually achieve success. Milei is a remarkable person, but he also rode a wave of popular support and people who just had enough of Peronism and believed that they wanted to live in a better Argentina. We should do the same here in South Africa.
Well, and it doesn't even take the example of Argentina, even a dysfunctional state. You show an example of a solution that changed something overnight. Of course, we know famously how Zimbabweans had to, just like the Weimar Germany, had to take wheelbarrow loads of notes to go buy bread just a few years ago. And they were suffering under the world's highest inflation, trillion%. It was insane what was going on. It took this so-called government of national unity that was forced by SADC after Mugabe lost the election but refused to give up the levers of power. But the MDC, the Movement for Democratic Change, came in and took over the finance ministry, which is what I'd hoped the DA would have done in the GNU, and overnight switched to the dollar as a currency and ended inflation and restored fiscal responsibility to Zimbabwe overnight. Now, it was short-lived, but the point is it changed a solution, changed things overnight. The same thing can happen in South Africa. It's going to have to take serious commitment, and that's lacking at the moment.
All right, Chris, thanks so much. I really appreciate it. I got to go, but yeah, chat to you soon.
All right, folks. David Ansara, CEO of the Free Market Foundation. David, thank you very much. Quel All right, I'll let him drop off, and then we'll wrap up this stream. We've got the news coming up at the top of the well, it's 6 p.m. South Africa time at noon here. Not the top of the hour. It's a little further away than that. But thanks everybody for tuning in. I appreciate it. And see, that's a problem, Rex. That's why I'm not a fan of these biometric things, because the biometric things can be hacked or can be misused by corrupt officials. And then suddenly you're not the person that you claim you are because someone is attached. Look, I mean, if you ever watch The Net, that's that movie with Sandra Bullock, how it's not so far-fetched where people broke into a system, changed her identity, put a criminal record of a prostitute, changed her photograph, changed her fingerprints, and claimed that she was a criminal. And then, no one knew her because she was a recluse and she did her work from home as a computer scientist. And what a mess that was. I remember that. It sounds far-fetched, but it's not so far-fetched, folks. Not so far-fetched. So anyway, people think that these solutions are perfect. They're not solutions that are perfect. Sometimes they're not when it comes to protecting your identity. Anyway, thanks for tuning in. My thank you to my guest, David Ansara. It's always a pleasure. And thanks for those of you who are upset by Charlotte Steenkamp. That guy is a very sad individual. I don't know what his personal malfunction is. And for some reason, he dislikes me. He lies about me. And he's all about race. And it's ironic that he comes in and accuses me of something that just hours ago, I released a video which refuted that and said that the government wasn't black. But he accuses me of saying it is black. The phrase West Africa time is a phrase spewed by West Africans. They coined the phrase because they know of the tardiness of officials in West Africa. And, a lot of people in South Africa always say that folks are on Africa time. I usually don't say that because I've lived all over Africa and I say West Africa time. Anyway, thanks, folks. We'll see you in a bit. Thank you for being here. Appreciate your support for the channel. Be sure to hit the like button if you haven't done that. I'm surprised we could have had more likes than we got, but thank you. These conversations are always helpful, and I hope that you got something useful out of this. All right. Cheers, and we'll see you a little bit later.